The challenge of a sound understanding of human nature on Qualia. The following work requires extensive interest of a monomaniac character. On physics, things are defined on each other. For example, in classical mechanics, mass is defined by acceleration and force. Force is defined by mass and acceleration is defined by force and mass. The physical system is necessarily built on such relations amounting to the classical meaning of relativity. Considering qualia is within such physical system, qualia must be due to the senses of relativity. From Wikipedia, examples of qualia include the pain of a headache, the taste of wine, or the perceived redness of an evening sky. As qualitative characters of sensation, qualia stand in contrast to propositional attitudes. End of quote. But certainly, there must be one element of qualia that is a propositional attitude, and a fair guess is to consider the order of evolution. What was the first sense of living beings? Either chemical signaling or the touch, but I would strongly argue for chemical signaling if finding food was more important than the benefits of tactile senses. There can be much more complex models of first senses. For example, one of sensorimotor awareness on top of parallel subsystems. Nevertheless, that dialectics, it is sure to expect other senses to be built in relation with the first. Qualia is due to such relation. Qualia can be hardwired and also oscillate along the firing parts of the nervous system. We know for a fact that drugs can change qualia as much as they can induce novel brain activity. Conscience is derived and formed by this activity. So, more boldly said, there is a complete physical correspondence for conscience. The complexity of a man's perspective comes from the mathematical system comprising of its fundamental element, the first sense. For example, blue is seen as blue because of how a mathematical function takes the basis of smells to relate with a light frequency, which explains how, statistically speaking, exposure to certain colors can induce behavior. Exposure to red increases appetite compared to controls. Exposure to blue increases trust, and so on. By this point, it is fair to say propositional attitudes are more fundamental than qualia. From Wikipedia, a propositional attitude is a mental state held by an agent toward a proposition. Proposition attitudes are often assumed to be fundamental units of thought and their contents, being propositions are true or false. An agent can have different propositional attitudes toward the same proposition. An example: John believes that his ice cream is cold, and John fears that his ice cream is cold. Linguistically, propositional attitudes are denoted by a verb, believed, governing an embedded that clause. For example, Mr. Salty believed that he had won. Propositional attitudes have directions of fit. Some are meant to reflect the world, others to influence it. End of quote. Also, it is fair to say the epistemological issue of qualia is solved and epiphenomenalism is refuted. People who are considered proponents of qualia are David Chalmers, Jonathan Lowy, John Barry Maund, Moreland Perkins, Howard and William Robinson, Edmond Wright, and the physicist Erwin Schrödinger, the man who created the Schrödinger's cat, obviously. The men working for the neurobiological blending of perspectives are Rodolfo Llinás and Roger Orpwood. Rodolfo Llinás says, when looked at philosophically, qualia becomes a tipping point between physicality and the metaphysical, which polarizes the discussion, as we've seen above, into do they or do they not exist, and are they physical or beyond the physical. However, from a strictly neurological perspective, they can both exist and be very important to the organism's survival and be the result of strict neuronal oscillation, and still not rule out the metaphysical. A good example of this pro-con blending is in Rodolfo Llinás' First of the Vortex, MIT Press 2002, page 202-207. Llinás argues that qualia are ancient and necessary for an organism's survival and a product of neuronal oscillation. Llinás gives the evidence of anesthesia of the brain and subsequent stimulation of limbs to demonstrate that qualia can be turned off, with changing only the variable of neuronal oscillation, local brain electrical activity, while other connections remain intact, arguing strongly for an oscillatory electrical origin of qualia, or important aspects of them. Roger Orpwood is an engineer with a strong background in studying neural mechanism. Proposed a neurobiological model that gives rise to qualia and ultimately consciousness. As advancements in cognitive and computational neuroscience continue to grow, the need to study the mind and qualia from a scientific perspective follows. Orpwood does not deny the existence of qualia, nor does he intend to debate its physical or non-physical existence. Rather, he suggests that qualia are created through the neurobiological mechanism of re-entrant feedback in cortical systems. Orpwood develops his mechanism by first addressing the issue of information. One unsolved aspect of qualia is the concept of the fundamental information involved in creating the experience. It does not address a position of the metaphysics of the information underlying the experience of qualia, nor does he state what information actually is. However, Orpwood does suggest that information in general is of two types: the information structure and information message. Information structures are defined by the physical vehicles and structural biological patterns encoding information. That encoded information is the information message, a source describing what that information is. The neural mechanism of network receives input information structures, completes a designated instructional task firing of the neurons or network, and outputs a modified information structure to downstream regions. The information message is the purpose and meaning of the information structure and causally exists as a result of that particular information structure. Modification of the information structure changes the meaning of the information message, but the message itself cannot be directly altered. Local cortical networks have the capacity to receive feedback from their own output information structures. This form of local feedback continuously cycles part of a network's output structures as its next input information structure. Since the output structure must represent the information message derived from the input structure, each consecutive cycle that is fed back will represent the output structure the network just generated. As the network of mechanisms cannot recognize the information message but only the input information structure, the network is unaware that it is representing its own previous outputs. The neural mechanisms are merely completing their instructional tasks and outputting any recognizable information structures. Orpwood proposes that these local networks come into an attractor state that consistently outputs exactly the same information structure as the input structure. Instead of only representing the information message derived from the input structure, the message will not represent its own output and thereby its own information message. As the input structures are fed back, the network identifies the previous information structure as being a previous representation of the information message. As Orpwood states, once an attractor state has been established, the output of a network is a representation of its own identity to the network. Representation of a network's own output structures by which representation its own information message is Orpwood's explanation that grounds the manifestation of qualia via neurobiological mechanisms. These mechanisms are particular to networks of pyramidal neurons. Okay. Although computational neuroscience still has much to investigate regarding pyramidal neurons, their complex circuitry is relatively unique. Research shows that the complexity of a pyramidal neural network is directly related to the increase in the functional capabilities of a species. When human pyramidal networks are compared with other primate species and species with less intricate behavioral and social interactions, the complexity of these neural networks drastically decline. The complexity of these networks are also increased in frontal brain regions. These regions are often associated with conscious assessment and modification of one's immediate environment, often referred to as executive functions. Sensory input is necessary to gain information from the environment, and perception of that input is necessary for navigating and modifying interactions with the environment. This suggests that frontal regions containing more complex pyramidal networks are associated with an increased perceptive capacity, as perception is necessary for conscious thought to occur. And since the experience of qualia is derived from consciously recognizing some perception, qualia may indeed be specific to the functional capacity of pyramidal networks. This derives Hopwood's notion that the mechanism of re-entrant feedback may not only create qualia, but also the foundation of consciousness.